12 rusted husks of metal, bleeding transmission fluid into the gravel. That was her idea of a punchline. Victoria thought wealth gave her the right to turn a single father's front yard into a junkyard just because he wouldn't sell his quarter-acre lot. She laughed in her temperature-controlled office, sipping black espresso, waiting for him to break. He didn't break. He wiped the grease from his cracked hands, kissed his daughter on the forehead, and bought her entire auto empire. Here is how it happened. Victoria hated the smell of the city in August. It always smelled like hot garbage and desperate sweat, even through the filtered vents of her chauffeured town car. But up here, on the top floor of the Kensington Auto Group headquarters, the air was scrubbed clean. It smelled of ozone, expensive leather, and cold glass. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling footprint of her flagship dealership. Acres of gleaming, aggressively polished inventory sat perfectly aligned under harsh LED lot lights. It was a monument to logistics and capital. And then, right at the southern edge, there was a jagged little cutout, a missing tooth in her perfect smile. David Miller's property. It wasn't even a house, really. It was a converted cinder-block garage with a peeling aluminum roof and a gravel driveway that looked like an infected wound against her freshly paved asphalt. She had offered him $500,000 for it. Then $1 million. Then $2 million. Every time, her legal team came back with the same response. He says it's not for sale. It's where his wife grew up. Victoria pressed 2 fingers against her temple. A sharp headache was forming behind her right eye. Sentimentality was a disease. It made people stupid. It made them hold on to depreciating assets out of some misplaced loyalty to ghosts. "Richard," she said, not turning away from the glass. Her chief of operations stepped forward. His shoes made soft, expensive clicks on the hardwood. "Yes, Victoria. The Miller lot. Have we exhausted the zoning complaints?" "The city inspectors won't touch him anymore," Richard said, his voice clipped. "He keeps the property just within code. Barely. The grass is exactly 3 inches. The noise ordinance is respected after 8 p.m. He's meticulous." Victoria took a sip of her espresso. It was bitter, metallic. She swallowed it down, letting the heat settle in her chest. "He thinks he's clever. A grease monkey playing hardball." She turned. Her tailored blazer felt tight across her shoulders. "Let's see how meticulous he is when he doesn't have a driveway." "Excuse me. The wholesale trade-ins, the unsellable scrap from the regional lots, the ones waiting for the crusher." Victoria walked to her desk, tapping her manicured nails against the mahogany. "How many are currently sitting in the holding yard?" Richard pulled up a tablet, swiping with a thumb. "A few dozen, mostly totaled sedans, blown engines, severe water damage." "Take 12 of them," Victoria ordered. "The absolute worst of the batch. Transfer the titles to a dummy LLC, then load them onto flatbeds and dump them on Miller's property." Richard paused. He looked up, his brow furrowing. "Dump them? Victoria, that's illegal dumping. We could face massive fines. Not if the dummy LLC is registered to an address we control, and then immediately files for bankruptcy. By the time the city traces the paperwork, the LLC won't exist." A tight, humorless smile touched the corners of her mouth. "The police will call it a civil matter. The city will cite him for having unregistered junk vehicles on residential property. He'll be drowning in daily fines by Friday. He won't be able to get a tow truck company to move them without clean titles, which are locked in the bankrupt LLC." "It's a prank," Richard muttered, realizing the scale of the spite. "It's an eviction," Victoria corrected. "Have it done before sunrise." She turned back to the window, watching the tiny, insignificant cars moving on the highway below. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel anything at all, really, except a dull irritation that she had to resort to such petty theatrics. But she was a CEO who governed $1 billion supply chain. When a pebble got stuck in her shoe, she didn't just remove it, she pulverized it. Down in the lot, a lone mechanic in stained coveralls was walking across the gravel of the cutout property. Victoria watched him for a second. "Enjoy your morning, Mr. Miller," she thought, the sarcasm heavy and silent in her own mind. "Tomorrow you wake up in a landfill." David smelled the diesel before he heard the engines. It was 4:30 a.m. The air inside the small cinder-block house was stale, thick with the humidity of a dying box fan that rattled in the corner of his bedroom. He lay on his back, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. His back ached. It was a deep, persistent throb in his lower lumbar, the kind that came from leaning over engine bays for 10 hours a day. Then came the smell. Unburned diesel exhaust, sharp and acrid, cutting through the damp summer air. He sat up, his joints popping. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble along his jaw. He hadn't slept well. He never slept well anymore. His daughter Chloe was asleep in the next room. If the trucks woke her up, she'd be cranky all day, and he didn't have the energy for a meltdown before school. The rumble grew louder. It wasn't passing by on the main road, it was close. The heavy crunch of tires on gravel echoed through the thin walls. His gravel. David threw off the thin sheet and walked to the window. He pushed aside the faded curtain. Outside, the darkness was violently pierced by swirling amber strobe lights. Air brakes hissed, a sharp, angry sound that made David wince. 3 massive flatbed tow trucks were backed into his driveway, their reverse alarms beeping in a chaotic, overlapping rhythm. "What the hell?" he mumbled, his voice raspy with sleep. He pulled on a pair of jeans over his boxers, not bothering with a shirt, and shoved his bare feet into a pair of work boots by the door. He stepped out onto the small concrete porch. The humidity hit him like a wet towel. The noise was deafening. The lead driver was standing by the hydraulic controls of his truck, pulling a lever. The bed tilted upward with a metallic groan. Cables snapped taut. "Hey!" David yelled, stepping off the porch. The gravel dug into his heels through his loose boots. "Hey, cut it!" The driver didn't look up. He just kept pulling the lever. A rusted, crushed 2004 Honda Civic slid backward off the tilted bed. The metal scraped against the steel deck, a horrific screeching sound that sent a jolt of nausea straight to David's stomach. The Honda hit the gravel with a heavy, dead crunch. Dust bloomed into the air. "I said stop!" David broke into a jog, grabbing the driver by the shoulder. The driver spun around, swatting David's hand away. He was a big guy, wearing a stained high-vis vest and chewing on a toothpick. He looked bored. "Don't touch me, pal," the driver said, his voice flat over the idle of the massive engine. "This is private property. You're trespassing. Load that piece of garbage back up and get out of here." The driver smirked, pulling a crumpled clipboard from his cab. He shoved it against David's chest. "Not my problem. Work order says, drop 12 units at this address. Paid in full." 12? David's stomach hollowed out. He looked past the first truck. The other 2 were already tilting their beds. A charred Chrysler van slid off, its suspension collapsing completely as it hit the ground. Behind them, 2 more flatbeds were turning off the main street, their amber lights flashing lazily. "You can't do this," David said. His heart was hammering against his ribs. An ugly, erratic rhythm, panic, cold and sharp, started to bleed into his chest. "I'll call the cops." "Call 'em," the driver said, climbing back into his cab. "I'm just the delivery guy. Take it up with the management." David stood frozen as the trucks continued their mechanical rhythm. Drop, scrape, crash, drop, scrape, crash. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky a bruised purple, the trucks were gone. The silence left behind was ringing and oppressive. David stood in the center of his property. The air smelled of rust, old rubber, and leaking coolant. His driveway was gone. His front lawn was gone. In their place sat a jagged, rusted maze of automotive corpses. They were parked inches apart, blocking his own truck in the garage, boxing in the front porch. 12 rotting hulks of metal. He didn't scream. He didn't fall to his knees. The movies always got that wrong. When real disaster hit, you didn't have the energy for theatrics. You just felt sick. A heavy, leaden weight settled in his gut. The front door squeaked open. Chloe stood there in her oversized pajamas, clutching a stuffed rabbit by the ear. She rubbed her eyes. "Dad, why are there so many broken cars?" David swallowed hard. The metallic taste of bile was in the back of his throat. He forced his shoulders to drop, forcing a lightness into his voice that he didn't feel. "Just a mix-up, Peanut. Go back to bed. I'll make pancakes in a bit." He watched her close the door. Then he looked up. Towering over his small lot, a quarter-mile away, was the glass fortress of the Kensington Auto Group. The early morning sun was catching the windows, turning the building into a monolith of glaring, blinding light. Victoria Kensington. David rubbed his thumb against his index finger, feeling the permanent grit of oil embedded in his calluses. He walked over to the nearest car, a Ford pickup with a collapsed roof. He leaned against it. The metal was already growing warm in the sun. He was tired. God, he was so tired. For 3 years, since his wife died, he had just wanted to be left alone. He ran his small shop, fixed alternators and brake pads for the neighborhood, and kept his head down. He had absorbed the grief, the debt, the endless grind of single parenthood, and he had survived. He had built a tiny, fragile bubble of peace, and Victoria Kensington had popped it because she didn't like looking at his roof from her penthouse. A dark, vibrating anger began to uncoil in his chest. It wasn't hot and explosive. It was freezing cold. It was the kind of anger he hadn't felt since his previous life, before the grease, before the cinder-block house, before he walked away from a career in corporate acquisitions that had nearly eaten his soul. He walked back into the house, bypassing the kitchen, and went to the small closet in his bedroom. He pushed aside a pile of old winter coats and pulled out a heavy, dust-covered Pelican case. He popped the latches. The sharp snap echoed in the quiet room. Inside sat a high-end laptop, perfectly preserved, its black casing matte and cold. David carried it to the kitchen table. He plugged it in. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale, clinical glow across his face. He didn't look like a mechanic right now. The slump in his shoulders was gone. His eyes, usually clouded with exhaustion, were locked onto the screen, sharp and calculating. "Okay, Victoria," he whispered to the empty room. "Let's see what you just dumped on my lawn." The police arrived at 9 a.m. Officer Miller, no relation, was a guy David knew from the local diner. He stood on the edge of the property, hands tucked into his duty belt, shaking his head. The morning heat was already cooking the spilled antifreeze, creating a sweet, suffocating stench. "Dave, I'm sorry, man," the officer said, stepping over a puddle of brown transmission fluid. "My hands are tied. I ran the VINs on 3 of these things. They're registered to an entity called Apex Salvage Holdings. The address is a P.O. box in Delaware." "And?" David asked, leaning against his porch rail, holding a mug of black coffee. "And I called the number attached to the business license. It's disconnected. According to the state database, the LLC filed for dissolution at midnight last night. The officer took off his sunglasses, wiping the sweat from the bridge of his nose. Technically, this is a civil dispute. I can't tow them. The city impound won't take private property without a court order, especially not hazmat liabilities like these. You're going to have to hire a private removal company or sue Apex. Sue a ghost, David said, his voice flat. Pretty much, but it gets worse. Code enforcement was driving behind me. They're giving you 48 hours to clear this up before they start hitting you with environmental hazard fines. $500 a day. David looked at his coffee. The dark liquid was perfectly still. Thanks, Jim. When the cruiser pulled away, David didn't panic. He walked over to the crushed Honda Civic. He popped the hood. It took a hard yank with a crowbar to break the rusted latch. He stared at the engine bay. It was stripped of anything valuable. The catalytic converter was long gone. He spent the next 3 hours cataloguing every vehicle. He recorded the VINs, took photos of the registration stickers, and noted the specific damages. His hands moved with a practiced mechanical rhythm, but his mind was running 1,000 miles a minute, calculating, organizing, hunting for the thread. He went back inside, washed his hands with gritty pumice soap until the skin was raw, and sat back down at the laptop. David opened a terminal window. His fingers, stiff from turning wrenches for 3 years, stumbled at first, hitting the wrong keys. He flexed them, breathed in the smell of stale coffee and hot electronics, and tried again. The muscle memory returned, sharp and precise. He didn't look at the Delaware Dummy Corp. That was a dead end, a firewall built by expensive lawyers. Instead, he pulled up the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System. He paid the commercial access fee using a credit card he hadn't touched in years. He started running the VINs backward. Car 1, Honda Civic. Previous owner, Kensington Auto Group. Date of transfer, yesterday. Car 2, Ford F-150. Previous owner, Kensington Auto Group. Date of transfer, yesterday. Victoria hadn't bought junk cars. She had used her own dealership's unsellable trade-ins. She transferred them to the dummy LLC to skirt the corporate disposal laws, then dumped them on his lawn. It was arrogant. It was sloppy. David leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked under his weight. Why use her own inventory? Why leave a paper trail, even a thin one? Because she thought he was stupid. She thought he was just a guy with dirt under his nails who would see the mountain of metal and surrender his land. She didn't think he knew how to read a balance sheet. He logged into a Bloomberg terminal emulator. The interface was a wall of dense, scrolling data that would make most people's eyes bleed. But to David, it was music. It was the language he used to speak before the world fell apart. He pulled the public financial filings for Kensington Auto Group. They were a massive entity, publicly traded, heavily leveraged. Victoria was aggressive. She expanded fast, buying up smaller dealerships, taking on massive short-term debt to finance the acquisitions. David spent 5 hours digging through the 10K and 10Q reports. His eyes burned. His back screamed at him. He ignored it. He was looking for the crack in the foundation. Billionaires didn't do sloppy things unless they were hiding something bigger. And then he found it. It was buried in a footnote on page 142 of their quarterly earnings report. Section 4. 1. Asset valuation and fleet inventory. David leaned closer to the screen. He read the paragraph 3 times. His heart gave a slow, heavy thump against his ribs. Kensington Auto Group secured their massive operational loans by using their vehicle inventory as collateral. The banks looked at the total value of cars on the lot and extended credit based on that number. But cars lose value. Used cars, especially trade-ins, depreciate the second they hit the asphalt. To keep her collateral numbers artificially high, Victoria hadn't been writing off her totaled, unsellable trade-ins. She was keeping them on the books. She was classifying rusted, engine-blown scrap metal as active pre-owned inventory. David looked out the window at the 12 rotting cars on his lawn. She hadn't just dumped trash on his property. She had dumped the physical evidence of corporate fraud. If a bank auditor saw these cars, they would realize Kensington's inventory valuation was inflated. If they realized it was inflated, they would call in the loans. If the loans were called in, Victoria wouldn't have the cash to cover them. The empire was a house of cards built on rusted axles. David rubbed his mouth. A slow, terrifying smile touched his lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a wolf that had just found the trap door to the sheep pen. He picked up his phone. He dialed a number from memory, a New York area code. The line rang twice before a smooth, cultured voice answered. Marcus and Hayes, Stephen speaking. Stephen, David said, his voice quiet, steady. It's David Miller. There was a long silence on the other end. David? Jesus Christ, it's been 3 years. I thought you were dead or living in the woods. I'm in Ohio. I fix cars. Stephen let out a short, incredulous laugh. Right. The rainmaker of Wall Street is changing oil. What do you want, David? I'm in the middle of a merger. I want to orchestrate a hostile takeover, David said, staring at the glass tower in the distance. I have the lever. I need your firm to provide the fulcrum. A takeover? Of what? Kensington Auto Group. Stephen choked. Are you insane? They're a $2 billion market cap. Victoria Kensington would eat you alive. She's currently committing massive bank fraud to maintain her credit lines, David said, his tone devoid of emotion. Her inventory is phantom. She's leveraged 80-to-1 on assets that are currently bleeding transmission fluid into my hydrangeas. I have the VINs. I have the title Transfer History. If we short her stock, leak the asset fraud to her primary lenders, and position ourselves to buy her debt for pennies on the dollar when the banks panic. David let the sentence hang in the air. He could hear Stephen breathing on the other end of the line. He could hear the gears turning in his old partner's head, the raw, predatory math of it. David, Stephen's voice dropped an octave. You're serious. I've never been more serious in my life. David stood up, walking toward the window. He placed a hand against the warm glass. She wants my land, Stephen. I think it's only fair I take hers. David hung up the phone. His hand was trembling. It wasn't a heroic, adrenaline-fueled shake. It was the terrifying, bone-deep tremor of a man who had just pushed all his chips onto a table he swore he'd never sit at again. He walked into the kitchen. The linoleum peeled at the corners near the sink. He opened the refrigerator. The bulb was burned out, leaving the interior bathed in grey morning light. A half-empty carton of milk, a block of sharp cheddar, and a container of leftover spaghetti sat on the wire shelves. It was the fridge of a man barely keeping his head above water. He poured the milk for Chloe's cereal. The carton felt unnaturally heavy in his grip. If he was wrong about Victoria Kensington's balance sheets, he wasn't just going to lose the house. He was going to jail for market manipulation. Dad? Chloe shuffled into the kitchen. Her hair was a tangled bird's nest of brown curls. She rubbed her left eye with a small, pale fist. The big trucks are still there. I know, Peanut, David said. He set the bowl on the table. Eat up. We have to walk to school today. My truck is blocked in. Chloe frowned, poking at the floating O's with her spoon. Are we in trouble? David looked at his daughter. Her innocence was a physical weight on his chest. He wanted to lie. He wanted to give her the saccharine assurance that everything was fine, but he respected her too much. A lady made a very bad decision, he said quietly. And now I have to clean it up. After dropping Chloe at the elementary school, a mile-long walk in the suffocating August humidity, David returned to his makeshift war room. The house smelled of stale sweat and ozone from the overheating laptop. He opened an encrypted email client. He drafted a message to Stephen. To S. Hayes, Hayes Financial. From D. Miller. Subject: The match attached are the 12 VINs, the title transfer histories from the state database, and cross-references to Kensington Auto Group's Q2 asset filings. The dummy LLC was dissolved at midnight. I need your analysts to map these 12 vehicles against her master inventory list. Once confirmed, initiate the short positions, drain my retirement accounts, leverage the life insurance policy. Everything. David hit send. He leaned back, listening to the hum of the box fan. It was a pathetic, rattling sound. Up in the glass fortress, Victoria was oblivious. She sat in the center of her boardroom, the air conditioning cranked to 68 degrees. It was freezing, but it kept people awake. She hated sluggishness. Her tailored charcoal skirt suit was immaculate, her posture rigidly upright. The table was a massive slab of imported marble that cost more than David's entire property. Richard, her chief of operations, was pacing near the digital whiteboard. The Q3 projections are tight, Victoria, Richard said, tapping a stylus against his palm. We're over-leveraged on the mid-sized SUV inventory. If the interest rates hike by even 0.25% next month, our carrying costs are going to trigger a margin call from First National. Victoria didn't blink. Then we don't let them sit. Liquidate the underperforming lots in the tri-state area. Run aggressive financing promos, 0% down, 96-month terms. 96 months. The risk assessment officer, a pale man named Thomas, swallowed hard. Victoria, we'd be writing subprime loans to people who can't afford the insurance, let alone the principal. I don't care if they have to live in the cars, Thomas. Move the metal. She tapped her gold pen against the marble. A sharp, definitive clack. I need revenue on the books before First National does their quarterly audit. How is the expansion project? The architect has the blueprints ready for the new service centre, Richard said, glancing at his tablet. But we still don't have the Miller lot, and there's a complication. Victoria's eyes narrowed. I thought we handled Mr. Miller. We dropped the inventory, Richard said, his voice lowering a fraction. But code enforcement hit him with fines this morning. They gave him 48 hours. Excellent. He'll fold by Friday. Victoria, he hasn't called our legal team. Usually when we pressure a holdout, they call screaming within an hour. He's completely silent. Victoria felt a tiny, irritating itch of annoyance at the base of her neck. Silence was unpredictable. She hated unpredictable. He's a grease monkey, Richard. He probably doesn't even know who to call. Send a junior associate down there tomorrow with a lowball offer. Tell him we'll wave a magic wand and make his junk problem disappear if he signs the deed. She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The leather chair let out a soft sigh as her weight left it. She walked to the window, looking down at the city. She was a master of the universe, moving pieces on a board. David Miller wasn't even a pawn. He was a speck of dust on the table. She had no idea the dust was toxic. It took Stephen's analysts exactly 6 hours to verify David's data. At 2:15 p.m., David's burner phone vibrated against the greasy workbench in his garage. He was currently shoulder-deep in the engine bay of a 2012 Honda Odyssey, wrestling with a seized alternator bolt. The smell of WD-40 and old oil was baked into his skin. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and answered, "You magnificent psychotic bastard." Stephen's voice crackled through the cheap speaker. "It's all here. The 12 cars on your lawn are listed on page 84 of their collateral manifest submitted to First National Bank last week. They claimed the aggregate value of those 12 units was over $200,000. David closed his eyes. The tension in his shoulders released, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. "They're scrap. Total value is maybe $3,000 in raw metal." "Exactly. And if she did this with 12 cars, she's doing it with thousands across her entire regional network." Stephen was breathing heavily into the receiver. "It's institutional fraud. It's Enron on wheels." "Are the shorts in place?" David asked, his voice deadpan. "We bought heavy. 50,000 shares shorted at $42 a share. It took every dime you had, Dave. If this doesn't break, you are personally bankrupt." David looked at his cracked fingernails. "It's going to break. Send the package to Arthur Pendleton. He's the chief risk officer at First National. Anonymously. Use the encrypted proxy." "Done." "Dave, are you okay? You sound like a machine." "I have to go, Stephen. I have a minivan to finish." He hung up the phone. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt the crushing weight of gravity. He went back to the alternator bolt, ignoring the sharp pain radiating down his forearm. By 4 p.m., the atmosphere inside the Kensington Auto Group headquarters shifted from sterile efficiency to controlled panic. Victoria was at her desk, signing authorization forms, when her private, unlisted phone rang. Only 3 people had that number: her mother, her lawyer, and Arthur Pendleton. She picked it up. "Arthur, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Victoria," Arthur said. His voice was completely devoid of its usual country club warmth. It was flat, bureaucratic, and terrifying. "We are freezing your operational credit lines, effective immediately." Victoria's pen stopped moving. The ink bled into the thick paper, forming a dark, ugly blot. "Excuse me. Arthur, we have a standing agreement. Our Q3 audit isn't for another month." "We received a whistleblower packet 30 minutes ago," Arthur continued, reading from a script. "It contained incontrovertible proof that Kensington Auto Group has fraudulently inflated its collateral inventory. 12 specific VINs, currently sitting in a residential junkyard in Ohio, are listed on your active, high-value asset sheet." The blood drained from Victoria's face. A cold, nauseating wave washed over her stomach. The 12 cars. "Arthur, this is a misunderstanding. A clerical error." Her voice remained steady, but her fingers gripped the edge of her mahogany desk so hard her knuckles turned white. "A clerical error that constitutes a breach of our lending covenants," Arthur snapped. "We are sending an emergency audit team to your regional lots tomorrow morning. Until they physically verify every single chassis on your books, you cannot draw a single dime. Good day, Victoria." The line went dead. Victoria slowly lowered the phone. The silence in her office was absolute. The air conditioning suddenly felt like a morgue cooler. "Richard," she screamed. It wasn't a corporate command. It was a raw, visceral sound that tore at her throat. The door flew open. Richard stumbled in, his tablet clutched to his chest. "Victoria, what's wrong?" "The 12 cars," she hissed, standing up. Her chair rolled backward, slamming into the window. "The ones you dumped on Miller's property, who did you tell?" "No one, only the logistics manager and the towing crew." "Someone tipped off First National." Victoria grabbed a crystal paperweight from her desk and hurled it at the wall. It shattered into 100 glittering shards, raining down on the plush carpet. She didn't care. The pristine illusion of her office was broken. They froze our credit. Do you know what that means, Richard? We have payroll on Friday. We have flooring costs. If we can't draw from the bank, we bounce checks to 3,000 employees. Richard's face went slack. That's impossible. How would anyone even know the VINs? Victoria stopped breathing. Her eyes widened, staring at the shattered glass on the floor. He's meticulous, Richard had said. He keeps the property just within code. David Miller, she whispered. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. She had assumed he was an ignorant peasant. She had assumed he would look at a pile of rusted metal and see only trash. But he hadn't. He had seen the serial numbers. "Get my car," Victoria ordered, her voice shaking with a potent mix of rage and terror. Now, while Victoria rode the private elevator down to the parking garage, the financial markets were waking up to the blood in the water. Wall Street algorithms hunt for anomalies. When First National froze Kensington's credit, the sudden halt in daily financial traffic triggered a red flag. Rumors of the freeze hit the private Bloomberg chat rooms by 4:15 p.m. Stephen Hayes was sitting at his multi-monitor setup in New York, his tie loosened, a cold cup of coffee forgotten on his desk. He watched the ticker for Kensington Auto Group, KAG. Time ticker price. Volume status 4. PMKAG, $42.10, 120K. Normal 415. PMKAG, $40.50, 450K. Elevated 425. PMKAG, $36.20, 1.2 million. Heavy sell-off, 435. PMKAG, $28, 4.5 million. Panic. "Come on," Stephen muttered, his eyes tracking the red lines cascading down the screen. "Bleed, you arrogant corporate parasite. Bleed!" He slammed his finger on the keyboard, executing a massive buy order to cover the short positions at $28, netting David a massive, instantaneous cash injection. But they weren't done. "Dave," Stephen said into his headset, "the stock is in freefall. They just halted trading. KAG is down 33%. "Good," David's voice came back, calm and detached. "Take the profits from the short. Buy their distressed corporate debt. The secondary markets will be dumping Kensington bonds right now for pennies. Buy it all." "Dave, if they go bankrupt, those bonds are worthless paper." "They won't go bankrupt," David said, "because I'm going to own them before Friday." The black Mercedes S-Class pulled up to the curb, its tires crunching softly against the gravel that had spilled into the street. Victoria stepped out into the oppressive heat. The transition from the climate-controlled leather interior to the heavy, humid air of the neighborhood made her physically recoil. It smelled of fried onions from a nearby house and the metallic tang of hot car engines. She stood on the sidewalk, staring at the property. It was worse than she imagined. The 12 crushed, rusted vehicles were stacked haphazardly, completely obscuring the small cinder-block house. It looked like a post-apocalyptic barricade. A heavy, dark anger boiled in her chest. She adjusted her blazer, ignoring the sweat already prickling at her hairline, and marched toward the narrow gap between a crushed Ford and a gutted Honda. "Miller," she barked. Her voice sounded thin and fragile in the open air. David stepped out from the side of his garage. He wiped his hands on a shop towel. He was wearing faded jeans and a t-shirt stained with years of grease. His face was smudged with dirt, but his eyes were unnervingly clear. They were the color of cold steel. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked at her the way a mechanic looks at a broken spark plug. "You're trespassing, Mrs. Kensington," David said quietly. Victoria stopped, her expensive heels sinking slightly into the dirt. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think pulling a stunt with First National is going to save this pathetic piece of dirt?" "I didn't pull a stunt," David said, tossing the rag onto a workbench. "You committed bank fraud. I just forwarded the mail." Victoria laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. I have a team of lawyers who will bury you in litigation until your daughter is old enough to vote. I will sue you for corporate espionage, defamation, and tortious interference. I will take this house, and I will take your livelihood." David leaned against the rusted hood of the Ford. The metal was burning hot, but he didn't flinch. "You can't afford your lawyers, Victoria. Not anymore." "Excuse me?" David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen and held it up. "Trading was halted on your stock 20 minutes ago. You lost $400 million in market capitalization before the bell rang. Your corporate bonds are currently trading at a junk status discount of 80 cents on the dollar." Victoria stared at the screen. The numbers blurred together. Her heart was beating so fast, it felt like a trapped bird battering against her ribs. "You're heavily leveraged," David continued, his voice maintaining that maddening, even cadence. "You use short-term debt to finance your daily operations. With First National freezing your accounts, you can't roll that debt over. By tomorrow morning, you will officially be in default on over $80 million of senior unsecured notes." Victoria felt the strength leave her knees. She locked them, forcing herself to stand tall, but the illusion was shattering. The smell of the spilled antifreeze was suddenly overwhelming. She felt bile rise in the back of her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, naked horror. Grease monkeys didn't know about senior unsecured notes. "Just a guy who wanted to be left alone," David said. He put the phone back in his pocket. "Before my wife got sick, I was a senior partner in distressed asset acquisitions at a firm in Manhattan. I spent 10 years dismantling companies exactly like yours. I quit because I hated the person I had to be to do that job." He took a step closer. Victoria instinctively took a step back, her heel catching on a piece of gravel. "I tried to be a good neighbor," David said softly. "I kept my yard clean. I didn't complain about the glare from your obnoxious building, but you couldn't stand that you couldn't buy me, so you dumped 12 tons of toxic waste where my daughter plays." I can have them moved," Victoria stammered. The words felt clumsy, alien in her mouth. She hadn't apologized or retreated in a decade. "Tonight, I'll send the trucks back." "It's too late for that," David said. "I don't want the cars gone, Victoria. I own them now." "What?" "I bought the dummy LLC's debt out of bankruptcy an hour ago," David said. "I also bought a controlling interest in your distressed corporate bonds through a proxy firm. I hold the debt you are defaulting on tomorrow." Victoria's breath hitched. The air felt too thick to inhale. She was suffocating in the middle of a driveway. You bought my debt." "I am your primary creditor," David confirmed. "Which means, when you inevitably file for Chapter 11, restructuring on Monday, I will be the one sitting at the head of the creditors committee, and I will demand equity in exchange for the debt." He looked up at the towering glass building in the distance, then back down at the ruined woman standing in the dirt. "I'm not going to sue you for this house, Victoria. I'm taking your dealership, all of it." Victoria couldn't speak. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The world was tilting on its axis. She looked at the rusted, bleeding cars surrounding her. They weren't a joke anymore. They were her tombstone. "Get off my property," David said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "before I have you arrested for trespassing." Victoria stumbled backward. She turned and practically ran to the safety of her Mercedes. She yanked the door open, threw herself inside, and slammed it shut. The tinted windows hid her, but David could see the silhouette of her burying her face in her hands. The car sped away, tires squealing in a desperate attempt to escape. David stood alone in the junk-filled yard. The silence returned, heavy and thick. He looked at his hands. They were shaking again. He clenched them into fists, forcing the tremor down. He didn't feel the triumph that usually accompanied a successful takeover. He just felt exhausted. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He had won. He had secured his daughter's future. But he had also resurrected the ruthless, calculating predator he had tried so hard to bury. The screen door squeaked open. Chloe stood on the porch, holding a juice box. She looked at the empty street, then at her father. "Dad," she asked, her voice small, "is the mean lady gone?" David took a deep, shuddering breath. He forced his hands to uncurl. He walked over to the porch and sat down on the top step, pulling Chloe into a hug. She smelled like strawberry shampoo and chalk dust. It was the best smell in the world. "Yeah, Peanut," David said, resting his chin on the top of her head. "She's gone. She won't be bothering us anymore." He looked out at the jagged skyline of rusted metal and the gleaming glass tower beyond it. The war wasn't completely over. There would be lawyers, board meetings, and a brutal restructuring process. But he held all the cards now. He was going to tear down that glass tower. And in its place, he thought, staring at the empty space on his property, he might just build a really nice garden. Monday morning tasted like battery acid and old coffee. David stood in front of the narrow mirror in his bathroom, adjusting the collar of a suit he hadn't worn in 4 years. It was charcoal grey, tailored for a man who used to spend his days in ergonomic office chairs, not bent-over engine bays. The fabric was tight across his shoulders now. His neck, thickened by physical labour, strained against the starched white collar of the shirt. He smelled faintly of mothballs and lava soap. He didn't look like a billionaire CEO. He looked like a bouncer at a mid-tier casino. "Dad?" Chloe stood in the doorway, a piece of toast in her hand. She stared at him, her brow furrowed. "Are you going to a funeral?" David let out a short, dry exhale. It wasn't quite a laugh. "Something like that, Peanut. I have to go to the city today. Mrs. Gable next door is going to walk you to school, okay?" He kissed her forehead, grabbed a battered leather briefcase from the hall closet, and walked out the back door. He avoided the front. The 12 rusted husks of metal were still there, baking in the early sunlight, bleeding fluids into the dirt. He drove his 2008 F150. The transmission slipped going into 3rd gear. He needed to rebuild it, but that would have to wait. Today he was dismantling a different kind of machine. The parking attendant at the Kensington Auto Group corporate tower tried to wave him off the executive level. David just handed the kid a $20 bill and parked the dented pickup between a pristine silver Porsche and a matte black Range Rover. The contrast was offensive. David liked it. He rode the elevator to the 50th floor. His stomach churned. It was the same cold, hollow nausea he used to get before a hostile acquisition in New York. He hated this feeling. He had spent 3 years trying to wash it off his hands with pumice and grease, but the predator was awake now, and it demanded to be fed. The doors slid open. The reception area was an acre of white marble and brushed steel. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset, looked at him with polite confusion. "I'm here for the Chapter 11 Emergency Committee meeting," David said. His voice was gravelly, quiet. She blinked. "Sir, that's a closed executive session. Creditors and board members only." David reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a thick, folded piece of legal paper and slid it across the marble counter. "I'm the primary debt holder." 5 minutes later, David pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. The air conditioning was aggressive, raising goosebumps on his arms. The room was dominated by a massive oval table. Sitting around it were 12 people. Lawyers in $1,000 suits, bank representatives with digital tablets, board members looking pale and sick. At the head of the table sat Victoria Kensington. She looked 10 years older than she had on his driveway. The immaculate facade was cracking. Her hair was pulled back too tightly. The skin around her eyes was bruised with exhaustion. When the doors opened, she looked up, and for a fraction of a second, raw panic flared in her pupils, before she forced her face into a mask of stone. "Mr. Miller," Arthur Pendleton, the representative from First National Bank, said. He stood up, smoothing his tie. "We weren't sure you'd appear in person. Your proxy, Mr. Hayes, is on the monitor." David glanced at the large screen on the wall. Stephen was sitting in his New York office, looking sharp and terrifyingly alert. He gave David a curt nod. "I prefer to handle my investments locally," David said. He pulled out a chair opposite Victoria and sat down. The leather squeaked under his weight. "Let's dispense with the theatre," Victoria's lead counsel, an older man with a flush of rosacea on his cheeks, snapped. "Mr. Miller, you purchased $80 million of senior unsecured notes at a severe discount. The company is filing for restructuring today. We are prepared to offer you a payout of 20 cents on the dollar, structured over 5 years, to clear the debt." David opened his briefcase. He didn't rush. He pulled out a stack of paper and set it on the polished wood. "No," David said. The lawyer sighed, rubbing his temples. 25 cents. Mr. Miller, if we go to bankruptcy court, unsecured creditors get pennies. We are offering you a clean exit." "You misunderstand my position," David said, leaning forward. He rested his forearms on the table. His hands, rough, calloused, and permanently stained around the cuticles, sat in stark contrast to the gleaming mahogany. He looked directly at Victoria. She refused to meet his eyes, staring instead at his hands. "I didn't buy the debt to make a margin on a payout," David continued, his voice dropping in volume, forcing the room to lean in to hear him. "I bought the debt to trigger a covenant default. You lied to First National about your collateral. You dumped 12 scrap vehicles on my property to hide them from the auditors. I have the VINs, the dummy LLC dissolution papers, and the state transfer logs." He slid a copy of the documentation to the center of the table. "If we go to bankruptcy court," David said softly, "this becomes public record. The SEC gets involved. First National will be forced to file criminal complaints for wire fraud and falsifying financial documents. Victoria doesn't just lose the company, she goes to federal prison." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that follows a car crash, right before the screaming starts. A board member at the far end of the table swallowed audibly. What are your terms, Mr. Miller?" David looked at the monitor. "Stephen." Stephen leaned into his webcam. "Mr. Miller will waive the $80 million in unsecured debt, and he will inject an immediate $30 million in liquid capital to satisfy First National's margin call and unfreeze the operational accounts. This will prevent a public bankruptcy filing and keep the doors open." "In exchange for what?" Victoria asked. Her voice sounded like dry leaves scraping on pavement. "In exchange," Stephen said smoothly, "for a debt-for-equity swap. Mr. Miller requires 85% of the voting shares, effectively absorbing Kensington Auto Group. Furthermore, the board will vote today to terminate Victoria Kensington as CEO, with cause, invalidating her severance package and golden parachute. Victoria shot out of her chair. It tipped backward, crashing into the glass wall behind her. "You are out of your mind. I built this company. I am the majority shareholder." "You were the majority shareholder," David corrected, not raising his voice, "until you leveraged your shares as collateral to buy out your regional competitors last year. When the stock tanked on Friday, those shares were called in. You don't own anything anymore, Victoria. You're just a squatter in a very expensive chair." He pushed a single sheet of paper across the table toward the board members. It was a drafted resolution. Resolution of the Board of Directors. Immediate termination of V. Kensington, CEO, for gross misconduct and fiduciary breach. Immediate issuance of Class A voting shares to D. Miller, proxy, Hayes Financial, in execution of debt for equity transfer. "Sign it," David said, looking at the pale faces of the board. "Or I walk out that door, I file the fraud packet with the SEC, and every single one of you gets named in the federal indictment for failing your oversight duties." They didn't hesitate. Survival was a powerful motivator. Pens clicked, paper rustled. Within 3 minutes, the documents were signed. Victoria stood against the glass, her arms wrapped around her stomach, as if she had been physically gutted. She watched the men and women she had hired, bullied and commanded, sign her empire away to a man who had grease under his fingernails. David stood up. He closed his briefcase. The click of the brass latches sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just felt an overwhelming urge to go home and wash his hands. "Security will need your badge, Victoria," David said. He turned and walked out the door. By 3 p.m., the 50th floor was a ghost town. The board had scattered, desperate to put distance between themselves and the fallout. The administrative staff spoke in hushed, frightened whispers. David was sitting in a small, windowless conference room, reviewing the operational ledger with Richard, the sweating chief of operations. "The payroll is secure," Richard stammered, tapping his tablet. "With your capital injection, First National released the freeze an hour ago. The regional lots are functioning normally." "Good," David said, rubbing his eyes. His headache had evolved into a dull, throbbing spike behind his temples. "I want the aggressive financing promos killed. No more subprime lending to pad the numbers. If we can't sell the metal honestly, we don't sell it." "Yes, Mr. Miller. Understood." Richard hesitated, hovering near the door. "Sir, Ms. Kensington is still in her office. She's refusing to leave until she finishes packing." David sighed. He closed the ledger. "I'll handle it." He walked down the long, carpeted hallway. It felt like walking through a mausoleum. He pushed open the heavy mahogany door to the corner office. The room was in chaos. The pristine illusion was shattered. Open cardboard boxes littered the floor. Files were dumped unceremoniously into them. The air smelled of expensive perfume and the harsh chemical tang of packing tape. Victoria was standing behind her desk, pulling framed photographs off the wall. She was moving erratically, her breathing shallow and fast. She had taken off her blazer, her silk blouse was wrinkled. When she saw David, she froze. She held a silver picture frame against her chest, like a shield. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice trembling. The arrogance was burned away, leaving only a raw, exposed panic. "You don't need to call security." David leaned against the doorframe. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, letting it hang loose. "I'm not calling security." Victoria dropped the frame into a box. It landed with a dull thud. She gripped the edge of the desk. "Why didn't you just take the payout? $2 million. I offered you $2 million for that miserable little dirt patch. You could have bought a mansion in the suburbs." "It wasn't about the money," David said quietly. "It's always about the money," she yelled, slamming her hand against the wood. "Don't stand there and play the righteous mechanic with me. I read your file this morning. David Miller, senior partner at Vance and Hayes. You were a corporate raider. You carved up manufacturing firms in the Rust Belt and sold them for parts. You're exactly like me." "I was," David admitted. The truth of it tasted like ash. "I was very good at it, and then my wife got diagnosed with ovarian cancer." Victoria blinked, the anger stalling for a second in her throat. "When you spend 12 hours a day in a hospital room watching someone you love slowly disappear, the numbers stop making sense," David said. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling window, down at the sprawling city. "I realized I had spent my entire life moving imaginary money around on a screen, building nothing, fixing nothing, just extracting value." He looked back at her. "When she died, I quit. I bought that little house because it was hers when she was a kid. I started fixing cars because I needed to put my hands on something real, something broken that I could actually put back together." Victoria stared at him. Her breathing slowed. The silence stretched out, filled only by the hum of the air conditioning. "I wanted to be left alone, Victoria," David said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I built a tiny, quiet life for my daughter, and you dumped 12 tons of toxic, jagged metal on my front lawn as a joke." "It was a business tactic," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "It was cruel," David corrected. "You didn't see me as a human being. You saw me as a rounding error, a glitch in your zoning map." He walked over to the desk. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked tired. "I didn't take your company because I wanted it," David said. "I took it because it was the only way to disarm you. If I had just sued you, you would have dragged it out in court for 10 years. You would have made my life hell. I had to take away your weapon." He pulled a small plastic keycard from his pocket, her executive access badge, and dropped it into the cardboard box. "You have 30 minutes to clear out," David said. He turned and walked toward the door. "What are you going to do with it?" Victoria called out. Her voice was hollow. "You can't run a $2 billion auto group from a cinderblock garage." David paused in the doorway. He didn't look back. "Watch me." 2 weeks later, the air in the neighborhood finally smelled like summer again. The sharp, acrid stench of unburned diesel and leaking antifreeze was gone. In its place was the rich, earthy scent of freshly turned topsoil and damp grass. David stood on his small concrete porch, holding a mug of black coffee. He was wearing faded jeans and a grease-stained t-shirt. The heavy charcoal suit was wrapped in a plastic dry-cleaning bag, shoved to the darkest corner of his closet, hopefully never to be seen again. A massive yellow front-end loader rumbled out of his driveway, its tracks chewing up the old gravel. It was a commercial rig, rented by the Kensington Auto Group Facilities Management Division. Behind it, a convoy of flatbed tow trucks, the same ones that had dumped the nightmare on his lawn, were driving away, hauling the rusted, bleeding corpses of the 12 trade-ins to a certified environmental recycling plant. He hadn't just ordered the cars removed. The leaking fluids had saturated his yard. So, as his first official act as the majority owner of KAG, he had ordered the company's heavy machinery division to excavate the top 2 feet of soil from his entire quarter-acre lot, haul away the contaminated dirt, and replace it with premium, organic topsoil. It was an exorbitant expense. The accounting department had flagged it. David had approved it anyway. "Dad," David looked down. Chloe was standing in the middle of the fresh, dark dirt. She was wearing bright yellow rubber boots and holding a plastic trowel. She had mud smeared across her cheek. "Yeah, Peanut. Mr. Hayes is on the phone. He says it's an emergency about the quarter numbers." She stumbled over the corporate jargon, holding out David's grease-smudged smartphone. David smiled. He walked down the porch steps, his work boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He took the phone. "Stephen, it's Saturday. The market doesn't care what day it is, Dave," Stephen's voice barked through the speaker. "The board is panicking. First National wants a revised projection for Q4, and the regional managers are asking who the hell is actually running the company." "You are," David said, taking a sip of his coffee. There was a long pause on the line. "Excuse me. I'm transferring 51% of my voting shares into a blind trust managed by your firm," David said. "You're the new acting CEO of Kensington Auto Group. The board will approve it on Monday. They don't have a choice." "Dave, you're handing me $1 billion supply chain. Why?" "Because I hate wearing suits, Stephen. And I have 3 brake jobs scheduled for Tuesday." David looked around his yard. The space felt enormous now. Liquidate the underperforming lots, pay down the short-term debt, run it clean, run it boring. I just want my dividend checks to clear so I can pay off my mortgage. He hung up the phone before Stephen could argue. He slipped the phone into his pocket and looked at his daughter. She had dropped to her knees and was digging a small hole in the fresh dirt. Beside her sat a crinkled paper packet of sunflower seeds. David walked over and knelt beside her. The damp soil soaked into the knees of his jeans. It felt cold and grounding. "Need some help?" he asked. Chloe nodded, handing him a few tiny, striped seeds. "Mrs. Gable said these get really tall, like taller than the house." "They do," David said. He carefully placed a seed into the dark hole. He covered it with dirt, patting it down with his rough, calloused hands. He looked up. A quarter-mile away, the glass fortress of the Kensington corporate headquarters caught the morning sun. It used to look like a weapon aimed directly at his life. Now it just looked like a building he owned, but one he never intended to step foot in again. He didn't need to sit in a refrigerated boardroom to feel powerful. He didn't need to crush people to feel safe. He had defended his home. He had broken the machine that tried to break him. And now, the only thing he wanted to build was right here, in the dirt. "Dad," Chloe said, looking at his hands, "you got dirt in your cuts again." David looked at his knuckles. The permanent stains of motor oil were now mixed with the rich, black soil of his front yard. He rubbed his thumb across his palm. It didn't hurt. "I know, Peanut," David said, smiling for the first time in weeks. A real, quiet smile that reached his eyes. "It'll wash out." David Miller didn't ask for a war, but when a billionaire CEO dropped 12 rusted cars on his lawn, she learned a terrifying lesson. Never underestimate a man with grease on his hands and nothing to lose. He didn't just fight back. He systematically dismantled her empire, taking her corner office not because he wanted the power, but because he wanted his peace. If you loved watching David turn a petty corporate prank into $1 billion hostile takeover, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who appreciates a cold, calculated reality check for the arrogant. And don't forget to subscribe. We've got more stories of unexpected justice and brilliant reversals coming your way. What would you have done with the dealership? Let me know in the comments.